the book of Psalms has a poem, one of many poems about exile. It's apparently written from the perspective of Israelites who have had to leave their home and are now in Babylon, another country in another empire far away, east of Jerusalem, far, far journey away, in the heart of what today is contemporary Iraq. Here's what the author says, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. Zion being kind of like a code word for Jerusalem here. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked for us songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The psalmist says. This theme of exile, of having a space, of being set somewhere by God, but then being ripped out of your place, having to leave, is a core biblical story. And it's a story of pain, but it's also a story of growth and renewal. This exile theme, you could say, even begins on a typological level, on a level of the pattern of the story, all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Do you remember Adam and Eve? They were placed in a garden, a land, a place all their own. They were told that there were conditions by which they could live there, and if they weren't able to follow those conditions, they would have to leave. If they didn't follow them, they had to leave. Even consider the directionality. They are kicked out of the garden after their sin of eating the fruit east of Eden, right? And they can't enter again. But then Abraham, when Abraham is called to be God's follower and Sarah his wife in Genesis chapter 12, where are they living? They're living in the east, let's say in Babylon, and they're asked to come back west to the promised land. So this pattern of a place and of leaving and of then coming back and being restored is a core biblical pattern. Indeed, you could even say that this pattern is really important to most of our lives, regardless of how you consider yourself spiritually. So for example, a lot of life follows a pattern of orientation, disorientation, new orientation. You start off a task, maybe it's like coming to college and you think, oh, college is so cool, I love this campus, I love my roommate, I'm so happy, and everything's great, no one can do any wrong, your head is filled with dreams of romance, whatever it is, right? But then comes a breakdown, a crack. You realize that maybe things aren't quite the way you thought it were. Maybe growing up in a family, it's kind of like being 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. It's like mommy and daddy are your heroes and they can't do anything wrong. And then something happens. You overhear an argument. You overhear something behind closed doors and reality breaks down, right? And now you're in the painful state of disorientation. Now dad doesn't seem like such a hero anymore. Now things have gone wrong. The question on biblical terms for Israel at this point in our story, and the question in terms of our own spiritual journeys, in terms of our life journeys is there anything after disorientation? We live in a space, it's fine, but then things break down. Can you come back? And that's really where we are at this point in the story, I think. God had created the world. God had given his promise to Abraham and to Sarah and their descendants that he would bless the entire world through them. Huge promise. Specific people, just a few people, but an explosive implication for all of humanity. Israel ended up down in Egypt. They ended up slaves. They were going to get trapped there. Oh no, what are they going to do? They got out in the Exodus story. God takes them to the holy mountain, Mount Sinai, where they receive God's law. He's going to give them land. He had already given them kids as part of the covenant he promised, but he's going to give them land. But they have to be fit to live in the land, right? So he's going to give them the law, the Torah, in order to know how to live in the land. He gives them Torah. Israel breaks the Torah. They wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, unable to really get it right. They end up dying in the wilderness. God brings an entirely new generation into the land. They fight for it. It's gritty, it's gross, it's warfare. They come into the land. This is the book of Joshua and Judges. Leadership is unstable. They finally get a king, but it's like the wrong king. It's King Saul. God says, no, I have not chosen him. Ultimately, I have chosen David. David is my guy. He's a man after my own heart. And so David becomes the king, and God makes him an extraordinary, lavish promise. You and your descendants will be king forever. I have established my name in Jerusalem. But the story of Israel's kings doesn't really go that well, right? The northern part of the country breaks away and becomes kind of like a rebellious civil war kind of situation. In the south around Jerusalem, they last a little longer, but in the year 586 BC, a great empire to the east called Babylon comes in, And this empire, Babylon, destroys the temple, burns it down, and takes a significant part of the population away into exile. And that's where the author of Psalm 137 is sitting, right there by that river, saying, how am I supposed to sing anymore? Am I going to forget Jerusalem? Am I going to forget my home? Can Israel come back from this disaster? That's the question that exile brings us to at this point in the biblical story. So, what we're going to have to talk about here today are 4 moments of exile, 4 expressions of exile, we might say. I want to talk about the story of exile through the characters in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I want to talk about 2 women whose stories mirror and tell aspects of an exilic experience, Ruth and Esther. I want to go back to some of Israel's wisdom literature, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and particularly the book of Job, to talk about suffering and loss. And then I want to end by talking about what it might mean to suffer in a way that has implications, salvific implications, for other people through the book of Isaiah. Let's do it. All right, let's get ourselves framed within a story, okay? And in order to get ourselves framed within a story, I want us to memorize some dates. In these videos I've been doing, we haven't been doing a ton of dates, but there are some dates that as a reader of the Bible, you just got to know, and I just believe in my heart that now is the time for you to know them, okay? When we talk about dates in the ancient world, a lot of times we're not talking about exactly precise dates. We're talking about dates that have a little lowercase c with a dot next to it, which is a Latin abbreviation for circa, meaning approximately about. Historians have huge debates about dates when things happened, and historians have huge debates about which parts of the Bible are actually historical. Just because something appears in the pages of the Bible does not mean it is a historical narrative. In terms of its genre, the Bible has many different genres. In fact, in a very creative kind of move, but also a confusing one to contemporary readers, the Bible may also mix what we would call today the genre of history alongside other kinds of genres that are not history, even within the same kinds of stories. And so that can create a confusing situation, creates a lot of really fun, good work for historians. And so you can go really deep down that rabbit hole. For now, I want to start with some dates, and I'm going to give you round number dates, but here are the dates I want you to remember, okay? Are you ready for this? You got your pen out? Are you doing this? Are you seriously doing this with me? Okay. The first date I want to give us is the Exodus, like when Israel leaves Egypt. I believe that that's an historical event. And I'm going to put a date on it, circa 1200 BC. Let's just say 1200. It's not perfect, but it's a date to kind of keep in your mind. 1200 BC. When does David become king? David becomes king. He kind of gets Jerusalem as his capital. This is the stuff that's happening in the book of 2 Samuel, chapters 1 through 5, roughly. Let's call that date 1000 BC. 1000. David becomes king. Solomon dies and the kingdom splits into 2 parts. Do you remember that thing from the kingdom lecture where the northern kingdom kind of goes off on its own and has their own king, and then the southern kingdom continues on under Davidic kings? Let's say that happens in the year 920 BC. Okay, 1200 for the Exodus, 1000 David becomes king, 920 Solomon dies and the kingdom splits. Around the year 720, so 200 years later, the northern kingdom, Israel in the north, is destroyed by the Assyrians. 720 BC. Really 722 or 721, but I told you, I'm giving you round numbers to keep them in your mind. It'll be good. And you'll be famous among your friends for having memorized these dates. Judah in the south hangs on for a little bit longer, but they are destroyed by the Babylonians. The temple is burned down in the year 586 BC. That's not a round number, that's a very specific number, but that number is just like a very iconic number that, in fact, you can memorize. 586 BC. A new emperor and a new empire comes on the scene, though, after the Babylonians. You can't rule forever, Babylonians. No, that's not a thing in this world, okay? This new empire is called the Persians, and the first Persian king is called Cyrus the Great. He marches in and overthrows the Babylonians in the year 539 BC, 539. And he does a number of things. We find this out right away, in fact, in the book of Ezra. This great King Cyrus is like kind of known in at least Jewish history as being friendly toward Israel in exile because he releases exiled people from their exile, even gives them a little bit of money to rebuild the temple. Okay, so he sends them home around the year 539 and afterward, and he gives them a little bit of money. Why does he do this? Is he just a nice guy? Well, you know, empires and emperors always have their own purposes. So I don't think from a historical perspective we want to just think of Cyrus the nice guy. But in fact, the Bible remembers Cyrus in a very friendly light. In fact, the author Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, in a couple of different ways between chapters 40 and 55, remembers Cyrus the Great in very exalted terms. Even calls him a Mashiach in Hebrew, Messiah figure, an anointed one, someone who's commissioned in a particular instance to save Israel. He sends them back, and it seems that they rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. So Solomon had built that first temple sometime in the 900s BC. You don't need to memorize that date, but memorize Solomon builds the temple, okay? And they send them back, and they rebuild that temple, and this is an event narrated in the book of Ezra around the year 515 BC. Ezra and Nehemiah then live in the 400s BC. So the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, especially the book of Ezra when it starts, it's narrating events that occur before the character Ezra really comes on the scene. What does this guy Ezra do? Ezra is really a community leader. He's a scholar and he's a teacher, and he rallies Israel not only to, operate in this new temple era. The temple had been rebuilt before he came back. He's sent there by the Persian leaders to come back and really just rally Israel. And he does so not for the Persians so much. He does so for his own faith purposes. He's going to teach people the law of the Lord that they have forgotten, okay? So Ezra is a teacher of the law. He's a scholar. He's a smart guy. You could think of him in Christian terms, kind of like a pastor, leader, scholar type guy, right? He comes back and he rallies Israel around this cause. Nehemiah, the next character who comes, and Ezra and Nehemiah overlap a little bit. It's kind of confusing historically, but you could kind of think of them as having overlapping careers, let's say. And Nehemiah really rallies Israel to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that had crumbled during this great destruction when the Babylonians destroyed the country. So does Israel come back from this exile? Do they actually have an historical comeback? Yes, they do. They come back and they rebuild the temple, and Ezra and Nehemiah rally the people around certain values and around rebuilding physically the infrastructure of the country. Those dates I want you to remember again in order. The Exodus, 1200 BC, circa, roughly. David becomes king, 1000. Solomon dies and the kingdom splits into two parts around 920. Okay. The northern part of the country, the northern kingdom, Israel, they're destroyed by the Assyrians around 720. Judah and Jerusalem are destroyed. The temple is burned, and the Davidic monarchy seems to be cut off in the year 586 BC. Cyrus the Great marches in and releases the captives back to their land, 539 BC. And the second temple is rebuilt around the year 515 BC. That second temple, by the way, is the temple that is still standing with modifications during the time of Jesus in the New Testament. And then that second temple, actually, spoiler alert, is destroyed in the year 70 AD by the Romans. And so there's no actual temple standing in Jerusalem today. There's just like a one section of a wall that's left over from those destructions. Today in Jerusalem, the so-called Western Wall or Wailing Wall, and you can go there today and see it if you go to Jerusalem. A couple of things from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that I think are important to emphasize. That image of a wall in the book of Nehemiah, it's both a physical, literal image. They really rebuild this wall, and Nehemiah helps rally them to do so. But it's also deeply symbolic of what this exile community has to do to survive. They set up walls not just as physical barriers against armies and invasion, but they set up cultural walls as well. There's a kind of focus inward as Israel is going to try to rebuild on things like, hey guys, let's go back to our old festivals, like Passover and stuff like that God told us to celebrate. We got to get back on that and celebrate that. And so they do. We got to get back into the Torah. We got to get back into the law. We got to get back into scripture. Where are all these writings? Oh my gosh, look at this. We got to get back into this. We got to learn this. And so they do. They also get really intense about issues of language and marriage. Issues of language and marriage can be really important to communities even today who are in exiles or in states of immigration or emigration back and forth from countries. To marry within your group and to speak a traditional language can be very important to people. You can maybe ask yourself in your own family history how important those issues are, or how your own parents would feel if you married someone who spoke a different language from you, or someone who maybe had a different ethnicity or background or even religious background from what you had. I know how those issues were treated in my family in a certain way, and it's kind of strange how intense people can really be about those issues, right? Ezra and Nehemiah get intense about those issues too, even to the extent where they frown upon what today I guess we would call interracial marriages, which seems kind of strange because it's like, why are they getting so intense about these marriage boundaries? And you can read a little bit about this at the end of the book of Ezra and at the end of the book of Nehemiah. They also get really intense about language. I don't know if any of you grew up in families that spoke a language different from English, for example. You could ask like your parents or your grandparents how they dealt with that issue of language and assimilation, and how do you know which language to speak and when. For a community that's in a sensitive position where their identity is threatened at total erasure, at being lost, we can maybe, even if we can't sympathize with the idea of Ezra and Nehemiah being so closed-minded in our terms about something like, marrying people outside the group or even speaking in a different language, I think we can at least appreciate this particular moment in Israel's history as being a very sensitive moment, one in which Israel is on an absolute brink of extinction. How are they going to survive this? And so through great leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, the people rally and they get a sense of their own identity. But keep in mind, again, this is not like Israel is not some huge and powerful military empire at this point, just like wagging their finger at the rest of the world, demanding that their identity be preserved and so on. This is an absolutely embattled group who has just had to return from a very dangerous and potentially deadly exile from a different place. So you're going to see these boundaries in Ezra and Nehemiah, and these boundaries are very important to the way that Israel is now going to think about itself in this very fragile period. Speaking of fragile scenarios, how do you survive exile? You go away. Can you imagine that? Maybe, I don't know. I don't even know who I'm talking to here in this video. Have you ever had an experience where you've had to leave your home under a really hard circumstance? Maybe a house fire. Maybe you've been in a country that had a political situation where you were forced to leave. What are the emotions that you feel? I don't know anything about what that's like. I've never been forced to leave my home in a way quite that dramatic. Maybe you have. I don't know. People do, though. I mean, this happens in the world, right? People have to leave their homes. How do you survive in a new place? Ezra and Nehemiah are one way when we think about that narrative. They kind of get their story straight. They go back to their past. They emphasize clear markers of their identity, and they stick together as a group. I want to introduce us to a couple of other biblical books that speak to this exilic situation. One of these books is actually explicitly set in the exile, the book of Esther. The other is not explicitly set in the time period of the exile, the book of Ruth. However, it has an exilic pattern to it. That pattern of you have a homeland, you have to leave your homeland, and then how do you come back to your homeland? So I'm drawing Ruth in because I think some of these same dynamics are really there. Let's take the book of Ruth now that we're talking about it. Ruth is a woman who is not even from Israel. She is from Moab. Moab is a country that borders on Israel. She marries into an Israelite family, but all of her husband and all of her in-laws, the male in-laws, die to the point where she's just left with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so mother-in-law and daughter-in-law are just left. And maybe by the rules of that time, the daughter-in-law, she could just leave. She's not even an Israelite. And in fact, her mother-in-law, who was an Israelite, tells her, look, your husband is dead, my husband is dead, our whole family's dead, just leave, it's okay. And Ruth has a famous line, one that's often read at weddings, interestingly, even though it was spoken from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. Ruth says, and I'm just paraphrasing, she says, I'm not going to leave you. Your people are going to be my people. Where you're from, that's where I'm from. Your God, that's going to be my God. And these two women stick together through this journey outside the land, and they end up coming back to Israel. And in this book, these two women actually scheme together to get Ruth married. It's like this crazy marriage story. Ruth ends up basically, in this really blunt way, proposing to this guy who should have maybe proposed to her, but he kind of didn't know. So she proposes to him, and then he ends up actually marrying her. They have a child, and then that child has a child. And guess who's a direct descendant of Ruth, this foreign woman from Moab? King David. And the Moabites actually in the Bible are enemies of Israel at some points. So yes, when you look at, the issues around intermarriage, like this idea of identity, only marry within the group that was promoted by Ezra and Nehemiah, you also see, though, that in the book of Ruth, the value of a Moabite woman, a foreign woman, her value indeed in the lineage of David, indeed in the lineage of Jesus in the New Testament is emphasized, okay? So that's a really special story, but it shows you how two women who are working together, who are sticking together, and who are relying on God can survive even in a situation of exile. Their exile is caused by famine, and then they come back. But a situation very much like exile, to come back and to thrive. Esther, on the other hand, she's living in the Persian Empire. The book has a setting sometime, let's say, in the 400s BC. It's not clear that this book is really an historical story or whether it's a kind of comic tale with a very serious point. Esther ends up becoming a queen in the Persian Empire during a really sensitive time when a Persian king was about to be convinced to kill all of the Jews living in what we might call the diaspora. Diaspora is kind of a fancy term that just means a group of people used to have a homeland, or they still do, but they've been spread. They've been dispersed all over the world. And so Jews lived in this state of diaspora all across the Mediterranean world, in Persia, in Babylon, in Egypt, in Spain, indeed eventually in the United States and all over the world. Esther is a Jew, and we can use the term Jew now to describe the people that we were calling Israel before, because Jews and Judaism are now terms that make sense in the exilic period. She's living in Persia. She's living in this diaspora. And she has to find her way to somehow stop this plot to kill all of her fellow Jews. How can she do it though? Can she just go directly to the king? Can she just tell him? She's not sure. She gets some advice from a relative who says, maybe you can hide it, maybe you can save yourself, but maybe you were made queen for such a time as this. She eventually does tell the king, there's this guy, this evil Haman, who has a plot to destroy my people, please save us. The king then does save the Jewish people, and it all ends well for the Jews. They have a holiday called Purim, which is a holiday, kind of like a carnival-like holiday of reversal. So the book has a happy ending for the Jews. I slipped a little bit there though, notice that, and I said, Esther's relative Mordecai says, maybe God has put you as a queen for such a time as this. No, that's not what the book says, because Esther is a very unusual book in the Bible for the following reason. The traditional text of Esther in Hebrew does not mention God at all. It's the only book in the Bible like this, where God, this main actor, is not even mentioned. Readers of the book of Esther could puzzle about that. Why not mention God? God is the main character in every book. Why would Esther not be praying to God? Why would her relative Mordecai not tell her to pray to God and to do all this stuff? But no, they don't. God, the name of God never appears in the book. No one even really prays in the book. There's a reference to fasting, could be a religious rite for sure, but a lot of cultures fasted. So why isn't God mentioned? One explanation that people have given for this, it's a very dark explanation about exile. It could be God's not mentioned because really, how do you survive exile? You got to be tricky, you got to be crafty and wise, and you got to be brave like Esther was. And you have to essentially figure it out on your own because God isn't coming to save you. That's very dark, right? There's another take on this that I like a little bit more in terms of the message of Esther, its spiritual message, which is this. When you're living in exile, when you're doing this exilic thing, when you're not sure what's right, when it's not obvious that God is really working, when God's not splitting the Reed Sea and doing all kinds of wild miracles, you might have to look for God in unexpected places. You might have to look for God in small, subtle things in the world through all the machinations and scheming and wisdom and good decisions and good choices that you make. That's a model for God's activity in the world too. Is it different from the way God acted in the book of Exodus or in the book of Genesis or in the book of Samuel with David? Yeah, it's pretty different, but it's no less powerful. But it requires a different kind of sensibility, a more mature faith, we might say. Ruth and Esther survive in exile, and they thrive through wisdom, through sticking to God, and through certain kinds of actions by which they're really very bold, and they come out and they save themselves and their families and their people. If you are in exile, here's another thing that you need: wisdom. 3 books of the Bible in particular are known as the wisdom books. It's not to say that there aren't wisdom elements elsewhere in the Bible, just that these 3 books really exemplify a very particular approach to thinking about the world. And those books would be Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. Were these books written during the exilic period or in response to exile? It's not really clear when a lot of the books of the Bible were written. The book of Proverbs has a traditional author, at least for the first several chapters, namely Solomon, and he lives long before the exile. But then there are some portions of the book which are said within the book of Proverbs itself to have been edited by scribes of a king named Hezekiah, who lives much closer to the exile, let's say, and then other materials that seem to come from a variety of time periods. So it could be that books like this really did take their final shape somewhat in response to this exilic period. Solomon is also the traditional author of the book of Ecclesiastes, although notably the book of Ecclesiastes actually doesn't explicitly name Solomon as the author. It could be that the author was living at a much later time and is speaking in a Solomon persona, which is what a lot of scholars think. You don't have to get all wrapped up in that, but that's just kind of like nerding out over issues of authorship and dating. But the book of Ecclesiastes, many think because of its language and because of expressions used in it, might come from a later date, which really speaks to an exilic scenario. The book of Job is a hard book to place in any kind of historical period. It seems to depict a character who's in a very old-timey kind of setting, but then again, many scholars think for super complicated reasons that it may have taken its current shape sometime during the 500s BC, which is prime time right in the heart of our exilic period. At any rate, this is a good opportunity for us to think about wisdom as an exilic motif. How do you handle really hard situations? These three books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, all have three really different perspectives, which I find as a Christian really helpful when I read scripture, to just know that scripture isn't limited to just one very narrow way of thinking about suffering or disorientation or exile, but rather that we have different approaches that are applicable in different scenarios. So the book of Proverbs, for example, is a great example of a book that's very much like very traditional kind of wisdom. The book of Proverbs says things like, look, stay on the straight and narrow path. Don't do absolutely horrible things. Don't do anything bad, actually. Don't dig a pit or set a trap, because you know what? You will fall into that pit or that trap that you set. People basically cause their own suffering in the view of the book of Proverbs, which very much resonates with the basic storyline from Genesis through the end of 2 Kings, which shows Israel sinning and then being kicked out of the land for that. So it's a very straightforward explanation of suffering. The problem with this, as you may have already guessed, is all suffering really predicated on a person's behavior? And does suffering work like that on a one-to-one basis? Did Israel really suffer so bad that they had to have their temple burned down? If you were an ancient Israelite, you might have questioned that. You might have said, sure, I committed a few sins. Maybe I'm not worthy in the sight of a holy God. But does my whole family have to be killed? Maybe you've had experiences like this in your life too, where you wonder about the one-to-one correlation between actions and your own suffering. The book of Ecclesiastes is a really different take. Right there, the key word is the Hebrew word hevel, which means something like vapor or breath, or by philosophical extension, absurdity. Or hevel can actually mean vanity. So a lot of translations will start off, vanity of vanities. What is life really worth? The author of Ecclesiastes, in the guise of the Solomon or Solomon-esque character, says, really nothing. I mean, there's really nothing you can do in this life. Everything is meaningless. Everything is vanity. Everything is fleeting. If everything is meaningless, why should I follow the Torah, the law? If everything is meaningless, why should I worry about proverbial sayings about whether I do a right thing or not? The author says, yeah, I know. I've seen it all. The truth is, you can really eat good food and drink good drink and have a good time with your friends and enjoy your youth, because you're going to get older and you're going to get judged. And there is a God in heaven. You're on earth. You should probably shut your mouth. Don't bother God with your prattle and your little prayers about all your little worries. That's not really what this life is for. That's not really what God is for. But God will judge you. And the book ends on a very stern note of judgment, even though there's the claim that life is meaningless. It is an absolutely stunning book. And it's a take on suffering, you might say on exile, that I think could strike a very contemporary note with a lot of readers who just look around and they're like, is God really here? Is anything really meaningful at all? Well, you have a friend in the Bible, even if that's your perspective, namely the book of Ecclesiastes, so be sure to give it a read. Now, the book of Job. What a book. The book of Job is about a guy who, according to the book, is totally righteous. He's done absolutely nothing wrong, and yet, because of a heavenly bet that occurs between God and maybe a character named Satan or another kind of heavenly being, the translation issue is a difficult one, they basically make this bet to say, what if we just torture Job a little bit? And then what if we torture him a lot? Will he still maintain his good behavior? Maybe it's the case that people behave in certain ways because they have a certain level of wealth, of prosperity. It's the classic privilege question. Maybe you were able to achieve so much because God has shielded you from any kind of misfortune. So they say, well, let's try it out. And they just strike down this poor guy Job. They kill his kids. They absolutely ruin all of his possessions. And it all happens on the same day. So as to make it look like almost there's no way that just happened by accident. Why do bad things happen to people? Read the book of Proverbs. They happen because you did a thing. So Job's friends come and they have this argument with him for 35 chapters straight. It's an absolute rip-roaring argument. And they're like, Job, let's just be real. Let's just be honest for a second. You're claiming you're righteous. Your life says otherwise. You just got destroyed. You just got owned. That doesn't happen for nothing. Can you imagine? The friends say things like this to Job. They're like, can you imagine if God just totally ruined someone's life for no reason? Can you believe it? Absolutely not. Turns out from the prologue of the book, chapters 1 and 2, you learn that's kind of what happened. It was a test. Is Job passing the test? Is he failing the test? The friends are representing a very traditional view. They happen to be wrong, though, about why Job is suffering. He's not suffering because he was wicked. He's actually suffering because he was so righteous that God and this other character take note of him and put him through this test. Finally, at the end of this debate, to everyone's surprise, I think, God actually shows up and gives them just a thundering lecture about what? About why Job has suffered? No, actually, God talks to Job and the friends about various cosmic phenomena, the hail and the snow, and wild animals, the kind of animals that you would find out in the desert places, animals that cannot be controlled, animals that you would be likely to encounter if you went on a very deep and frightening wilderness wandering. And God says, see all of this? Can you control all of this? Were you the creator of this? Is this yours? No? I didn't think so, so shut up. And Job is like, I got it, I shut up. I'm sorry. God says, good. And then gives him all his stuff back in the end. Within the pattern then of the book of Job, you see this kind of orientation, disorientation, new orientation. Orientation, Job is living in a dream world. He's a good guy and he's got a lot of stuff. He's got a nice family, great. Disorientation, he has a breakdown. He doesn't know why. He can't figure it out. He gets a speech from God, though, that reorients him in his place in the cosmos and says, Job, you are not at the center of the world. Things happen and you may never know why, but I, God, am in charge of the entire cosmos. I created it. It might look ugly to you. You might not like my world, but this is my world. You don't like my world? I created this world, and you have to live in it, and you have to learn to thrive and survive, even under very harsh circumstances. And in the end, Job accepts that message. Wisdom is a way to thrive in exile. Here's what I can understand. A situation where there's a one-to-one correlation between what I have done and what I have suffered. I get that. I mean, imagine in life if you totally severed the link completely between actions and consequences. Like, that would be crazy. The world would be in a state of moral chaos. But that's precisely the problem that the book of Job presents us with, at least for a time. Someone who suffers badly through no apparent fault of their own. What happens, though, when you suffer? Not just suffering for something that you did, but you suffer like above and beyond the boundaries of what you should. Or even if you suffer as a totally innocent person. What does it mean? Are we willing to accept as people the fact that some people have just suffered and been just wiped off the face of this earth, and that just meant nothing? A tsunami comes, kills 100,000 people. What did it all mean? Nothing. It just meant nothing. On biblical terms, there is a model for thinking about innocent suffering, and this is a model that's going to take us as a bridge into a model for salvation, for being saved, for the whole human race potentially in the New Testament through Jesus Christ, through his death on the cross and his resurrection. But I want to back up to this exilic theme of suffering in order to provide one final example of what it might be like to think of yourself suffering in exile on biblical terms, particularly in the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah chapter 40, we get a massive turn, a turn toward a new scenario. A scenario where now Israel isn't just living like they are at the beginning of the book in the 8th century, in the 700s BC, but they're living in the 500s. They are in exile in Babylon. And Isaiah chapter 40 starts this way, really striking. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. There seems to be now a voice crying out into this wilderness of exile, asking the people to make another journey like they did after the Exodus. There's a whole lot of typology and pattern stuff going on in these chapters of Isaiah, and asking her to return to the land. But what is this thing about paying double for the sins? Like, why should they pay double? I don't want to pay double for my sins. I have enough sins and I have enough paying just like one for one. I don't want to pay double, right? Does Scripture have any model for what it's like to pay double for your sins? Certainly someone like Job suffers beyond the boundaries of what he seemed to deserve. And at the end of the book, when the friends need to be forgiven for their horrible words against Job, God doesn't actually ask the friends themselves to repent. He asks Job to pray for them. which is a really funny model. Like, shouldn't the friends have to just like say they're sorry to God directly? Why have to go through this intermediary? Why does Job have to do it, you know? We also saw this model way back in the Torah, in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, the idea that Moses, who is a righteous individual for the most part over and against the people, intercedes for them. He can pray for them, and his righteousness and the fact that he suffers along with them gives him a certain kind of power with them. We also see in the book of Leviticus a ritual model like that of the scapegoat, where Israel takes a goat, confesses their sins, literally presses their hand on the head of the goat, and like puts their sins on the animal, and then kicks the animal out into the wilderness. So there you have a model too, where this animal didn't really do anything, but it's like the animal serves as a site for suffering, even for death and for sin, and to take that all on. The book of Isaiah has a character that keeps coming up over and over again in chapters 40 through 55, even beyond to the end of the book in chapter 66, a character that in Hebrew is called the Eved, or in English, the servant, or really the slave. And this servant character is mentioned over and over again as sometimes a single individual, but sometimes identified with the nation of Israel itself. And I want to read you a very, very particular and very famous description of the servant in Isaiah chapter 53, which takes us deep into the heart of this mystery about suffering on behalf of another person, or when your suffering goes too far. And in this case, speaking to the exilic scenario. Isaiah 53 reads like this, and I'm just going to skip around some verses, but I'll start in verse 1. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. What an amazing description, right? Like, who is the author talking about? Some individual who doesn't really have anything special about him, but who is punished, physically beaten and hurt so badly that their suffering, it's so innocent that they are able to even heal other people. That phenomenon of innocent suffering, it's far from being meaningless. It means so much that God can even use it to heal other people. We might call this in theological terms the idea of vicarious suffering, the idea that one person can actually suffer for another person. Is that really true, though? I mean, think about that in your life and in the world that you see. Can one person's suffering really mean something in terms of life, in terms of healing for another person? In the book of Isaiah, this mysterious character of the servant is imagined as one who can actually bear that suffering. And in some places in Isaiah, by the way, that servant is actually named, and it's a group identity. It's Israel. Israel itself, corporately, the nation in exile, is that servant. And that servant suffers by going into exile, and somehow, by suffering maybe even more than they deserved, they get to come back into the land, and then they might be able to rebuild something, and it will mean something positive in terms of healing for other people. So there's that corporate identity that I think is very much there in the book of Isaiah. But there are also these haunting descriptions of a single individual, someone who could actually take on all of that pain, all of that suffering, and it would mean something for other people. Exile happens. Empires rise and empires fall. First it was Egypt, then it was Assyria, then it was the Babylonians who burned down the temple. After the Babylonians, though, it's going to be the Persians. After the Persians, it's going to be the Greeks and Alexander the Great. After the Greeks, it's going to be the Romans. And by the time we get to this part of the Bible we call the New Testament with Jesus in it, we're going to have a new empire on the scene, namely the Romans, telling everyone what to do, occupying the land, and even giving Israel a kind of exile even in their own homeland. The book of Leviticus, though, particularly in Leviticus chapter 25, had a very strong statement about the land and about God's feelings toward it. God said in Leviticus 25, you can't even sell the land permanently. Why? Because the land is mine. But there's a problem. How can the land be God's? How can the land belong to Israel by way of that covenant when God had promised it to Israel, when in fact it belongs to Assyria, to Babylon, to Persia, to Greece, to Rome? There's a conflict here, right? How is God going to solve this conflict? And ultimately, on biblical terms, it is up to God. Even though Israel sins and they can get kicked out and they can do what they do, but God is the main actor in the story. Don't ever lose that plot line. How is God going to make this right for Israel? They're living in a land, but it's really not their own, but it's supposed to be their own. And we still have that big promise from the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 7, to David, namely that David, an heir of David, would be the king and would remain on the throne forever. God promised that, and there were no conditions. How is God going to make that real? How is that going to be true, even if it doesn't seem to be literally true with Israel, with their own king, when these other empires are ruling? Those big pieces of drama are left hanging up in the air for Christians by the time we end the Old Testament as we now have. So we're going to need to get into the New Testament in order to see what God's answer is to Israel about the covenant. I've been struggling today, physically. Just, my chest feels just like tight, you know? I don't know if I'm having like a low-grade continuous panic attack. It's possible.